Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rehash, a Web3 podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and today we're speaking with Bethany Crystal about all things fractional work, using AI to improve our learnings and workflows, and we wrap up with a quick discussion on the Bitcoin developer ecosystem. I've known Bethany for a while now in the Web3 space as the fractional work queen, and she shares very openly in this episode about her experience as a fractional worker in Web3, what her process looks like, and some practical tips for other people to think outside of the box about how they want to work. As a mother of two and a hobbyist of many things, Bethany has had to think creatively about how she can find the best balance for herself to be able to do all the things that she wants to do in life. For her, the answer was fractional work, or working on various projects on a contract or part-time basis so that she has time for other aspects of life she enjoys, and so that she can also have her curiosity constantly satisfied with a variety of different projects. Bethany talks about some of the pros and cons to being a fractional worker, the types of people she believes are best suited for the job, and she also gives us practical tips for identifying our own core skill sets and finding work. She also shares some of the ways that she's been using AI to aid in her workflow and help her learn new skills at a much faster rate as well. If you're interested in new ways of working, or perhaps even looking to rethink the way you work yourself, you won't want to miss this episode with Bethany. I have no doubt that you'll take away something inspirational and actionable to implement in your own life that will help you not only work more effectively, but also live more effectively as well. Bethany was nominated by DeFi Beats and voted onto the podcast by DeFi Beats, Parker J. Pasharat, Burb, Triumph, Fifth World Zach, David Phelps, Spencer Graham, Andy Boyan, and Nick Naragi. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Bethany. Bethany Crystal, I'm so glad to have you here. DeFi Beats is one of our favorite Rehash members. He's got this whole playbook for how to get guests on the podcast that he's used for himself and for multiple guests, including yourself now. So he is definitely the pro when it comes to guest elections. He always dominates every round. So if you have anyone in mind that you're trying to nominate for next season and you want a surefire way of getting them on, just you know who to go to, the man, DeFi Beats, to get all the insider tips about
He knows how to campaign. I definitely will give him that. It was impressive.
He is the campaign master. And I have to give you a hat tip to you too, for I feel like you did a great job with campaigning too in this season. I saw you out there on Twitter constantly tweeting and really, stepping up for yourself, which is a great thing to do that very few people actually do. So you also put in the work. Kudos to you. Can't wait to see who you nominate for next season, passing it on forward. But today I'm really excited to talk to you all about fractional work. I have known you as the fractional work queen for quite a while now in the space. And I'm really excited to have the chance now to sit down with you and pick your brain about how you got started in this, what exactly fractional work is, and all the ins and outs of that. So I think to start off, I would love for you to just define how you think of fractional work. I think the way I think about it is sort of like the next iteration of freelancing, but I'd love to hear it from you. Like, how do you see it different from freelancing, or is it similar? Or what are the components of fractional work in your mind?
Yeah, it's interesting. And thank you again for having me. I'm excited to come in and talk about a lot of this stuff that I've been thinking about for many years. When I think about fractional work, it really to me feels like the new way of working. It's less about getting a job and more about creating a portfolio of work that supplements the life that you want to have. So fractional work is not necessarily freelancing in that it's like a lot less one-off project based. Like when I think of a typical freelancer, it's maybe coming in and doing a single website project or a single design project, or in the case of like writers, a single content piece. But for fractional work, it's really dedicating a fraction of your time to multiple places simultaneously. What's interesting is the more I've been doing this, the less it's been about doing the same type of work in one place and more about diversifying that work. So in certain types of companies, I'll come in more of like an operational role, and others will come in more of like an advisory role. The way that I'm accruing income is also changing, and it's developing a really unique portfolio of work.
Yeah, super interesting. So that's where the term fractional work comes from, is you're giving a fraction of your time to each of these different projects. Can you give us a little quick background about how long you've been doing fractional work and some of the cool projects that you've worked on and your role and your capacity and, sort of like how you decide? I mean, what's the process? Like, how do you, I was going to ask, like, how do you decide what you're going to do for them? But maybe that's not even where the process starts. Like, what does the process even look like?
I think it sort of comes down to what do you want to be spending your time on? And how can you use your work life to create a balance that feels really good for yourself? I was working in venture capital firm for about 5 years, and I had a really unique vantage point into 100 different companies and what they were doing in their portfolio. And I realized that working at just one place forever in one singular capacity was just not how my brain was wired. And the first job I took after working at Union Square Ventures was at this company called Bolster that was run by one of the CEOs that I admired the most in our portfolio. So I really wanted to see like what that felt like from the inside. And what we were building was a marketplace for people who wanted to work fractionally. So in that job, I actually had a lot of experience in seeing the profile of a fractionalized person. And I was able to see, yeah, you could do fractional work as a CFO or finance person. You could do it as a legal person, as an HR person. But I was seeing and learning and writing about how people were doing fractional work as marketers and business development folks and operations folks. And even like fractional CEOs is a thing you could sort of do. About a year into that job, it was a lot happening during the pandemic. There was a lot happening in COVID, and the crypto market was really like booming and taking off. But I had been living in Australia for like a weird period of time during COVID. And I came back and realized basically all of crypto had moved from San Francisco to New York City in the 6 months that I'd been gone. And so I got back and I had this full-time job, but I was spending like my nights and weekends doing crypto hacking. And I was also spending my nights and weekends on this education initiative in New York City. And I was actually paying a babysitter to watch my daughter so that I could spend more time doing these hobby projects on my nights and weekends. At some point, I was like, something is not working here. I shouldn't have a full-time job and hobbies that I'm like paying for. So I asked these people, I was like, hey, is there any world where you would pay me to like do some of this in a part-time or fractional capacity? And these like 2 or 3 other projects I'd been kind of courting both said, yeah, that would definitely be interesting. So then I went back to my CEO and I was like, hey, actually, I want to drop down to a third time working with you. And so I can take up like a third of my time pursuing this education pathway and a third of my time like pursuing this crypto pathway. So I started in like 3 fractions. And now like 3 years later, like my fractions are developing fractions and it's becoming like a little insane, but it's pretty fun.
So as somebody who's done a little bit of fractional work myself, I think one of the biggest challenges I experienced personally when I was doing that work is the constant context switching. And also maybe this is just my experience, you tell me if you can relate to this, is when I have told these projects that I'm working on a part-time basis, like this many hours a week, it always turns into more than that somehow.
Oh yeah. I have major boundary issues, so I experience this as well.
Okay, so it's not just me. So talk to me about how you address this, because those 2 things, like the constant context switching, which I think, even now, it's like that's always been a challenge since I've been working in this space. If you're part of any DAOs, if you're part of like any projects, any other communities, like you probably experienced this. And then B, like the setting boundaries with what actually is part-time and not pushing those and ending up working full-time, being paid for your part-time work. How have you addressed those?
I think, unfortunately, the only way to address it is to practice it and then be really like mindful about what's working and what's not working. And I was lucky in that I'd had a series of like increasingly independent jobs, even in a full-time capacity, just like, if anyone's ever worked at a startup in a role that changes every 3 to 6 months, or you're maybe the only person on your team, like you are acting in an entrepreneurial way in that role. So you likely are developing your own systems for, do you take meetings in the morning or do you take meetings in the afternoon? Do you block deep work on your calendar? If so, how much do you need? And I think every time you do a little bit more of that, you learn about your own inclinations of how you work. So going into fractional work, I already knew I had the sort of internal cadence to sort of be self-motivating enough. And then what I was able to do is say, okay, how much time a week do I need to dedicate to each of these projects of work where I need to be actually at my computer, headphones on, getting something created? How much time do I need to dedicate in meetings? Meetings is where fractional work really goes off the rails, by the way. Like, it's so bad. I had a day like in February where I had 12 meetings and they were not all 30-minute meetings. One of them, it was like 90 minutes. It was insane. I was in meeting from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. That is a bad day of fractional work. So you have to sort of like figure out where those cadences of work for yourself are. And then one thing I have also learned about myself is I can be in like startup work mode on one project. So typically I will have like 40 or 50% of my energy space to dedicate towards like a new project or like a big lift. And then there's maybe like 20 or 30% of my space needed to maintain a project. But I don't actually charge based on that. I can charge the same for both of those projects. It's just how I'm like sort of mentally blocking my time. And then I have like a really long tail of projects that I can just sort of like hold court in, like checking in once a week, checking in twice a week, checking in once a month. There's sort of like a long tail effect there. And I think that's where like the more you learn how to balance the load, the more you can figure out what that looks like for you. But it's not like a straightforward thing. I did write a blog post a couple weeks ago about like time management for fractional workers that gives like a couple of ideas for how you might think about this yourself, but it's definitely a iterative process.
Yeah, I'll need to go read that for sure for myself. So what are some other pros and cons that you can think of to fractional work? And do you think that there's a type of person that's best suited for fractional work?
I've seen lots of different permutations of fractional work. I think I have a particularly unique approach in that I like to do fractional work and I like to take on projects that I have never done before. And for me, it's a really easy way to learn something new in a project-based capacity and then decide if I want to do more or less of that. I have a lot of fractional friends who use fractional work to work smarter, not harder. So you find one thing you're really good at, you get really, really fast at that one thing, and you can have 10 clients doing that one thing and only still work like 20 or 30 hours a week. And that's like very cool. So I think it sort of depends on, do you want to double down on one thing and make that your specialty area? Or do you want like a portfolio of work? Or do you want to do fractional work in order to understand what you want to do full time? And that's like one sort of way to think about it.
Gotcha. And do you think that there's like a certain type of person or personality that's best suited for that work?
I think you need to be able to be self-managing. I think you need to be able to find business yourself. And there's an idea that you're never not looking for your next job that I think tires out most people. That's where I've seen a lot of my fractional friends sort of decide it's like not for them anymore. Because it does definitely ebb and flow. Like my income streams vary like erratically. And I think that's like sort of par for the course, the seasonality of that work. So if you're very uncomfortable and anxious around that kind of thing, I don't think that it's good for you.
Yeah, absolutely. What have been some of your learnings so far about finding work and finding business? Have you, developed any playbooks or developed any tips that have worked better for you? Obviously, a lot of it is dependent on the market cycles and kind of, especially in the crypto space, it's so dependent on market cycles and where we are. If we're in a bull market, it's like probably, I imagine, so easy to find fractional work and get paid a lot for it. Whereas in a bear market, everyone is kind of holding tight to their money and scared to pay anyone for anything.
I think one really nice thing about working fractionally is that you can basically hedge against a lot of the industry challenges, because even in tougher job markets, there is some industry that is hiring and some industry that needs help. And even in a tougher job market, it's easier to get a fractional job than a full-time job. So because I can work across sectors, I find it to be like I'm a little more inured to the idea of like labor market challenges. I also think because I first graduated from college in the middle of a recession with a degree in journalism and could not get a job in journalism, I've always just sort of had this mindset that my job is about the skills that I can bring. And I've just been looking at that subset of skills in a really versatile way since the beginning. But to come to your question about how to get jobs, I think this is also really different for everyone. I think in order to be an effective fractional worker, you need to really understand your unique special sauce of what your skill is and like lean into that in order to get your next job. for me, the thing that I can carry with me and bring everywhere is my network. So I am able to use my network to find my next jobs. And it comes incredibly naturally to me to meet people for coffee, check in with people on Zoom, send emails when I read something that someone wrote, send a text, like blog about a thing. So that process has been like generating me a pretty healthy inbound pipeline of work. And I've also been learning how to signal to like my potential client base, I guess, what types of jobs I want based on like the way that I'm sort of like writing about and positioning myself. And I've gotten better at that over the past couple of years too.
What tips do you have in that regard? Because I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with is talking about themselves, promoting themselves. Like that feels very uncomfortable and unnatural to a lot of people. So what has worked for you?
Well, I say I wanted to go through like a rebrand. So I've had jobs in sales and marketing. I had this job in BC running a community. And then I was working in like a business development partnerships role at this startup. And the easy job to get in crypto would have been like community manager, but I really didn't just want to be pinned as a community manager forever. So I really intentionally tried to have community be like a how I do my work and not the what that I do for my work. So I've been like steadily working towards like changing that narrative to one that's like strategy or operations or advising or coaching or like leadership, and like the jobs that I take and the titles that I take and the stuff they write about, it's all sort of like compounding into that narrative. So I think it's been happening slowly over time. And, you know, now that I've had a couple of roles that I feel have been more like cross-functional and like versatile, I'm doing some stuff that's like more like VC related work. I'm doing stuff that's more startup related work. I'm doing some stuff that's more foundation related work. And now I can sort of like bring that all back together again. I did actually have someone help me on my like website branding, where there's a really cool exercise that we did that you could probably do too. But we emailed like 8 or 10 people I'd worked with recently and asked them, what are the things that you hired me for? What's like 1 or 2 words that you would use to describe me? What's like fictional or non-fictional person that you think like I remind you of? And then we pulled all those things together. We sort of came up with this like 1 or 2 sentence like narrative about it, which some of that theme is still resonant on the website that I have. But I try to save about 20% of my time to be building out the brand or the business part of my fractional work in addition to the actual work that I'm doing for clients. But there are periods where I have 0% of my time to dedicate to that. And then there are times like now where I'm like 50% dedicated to that.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that is kind of like the first big challenge of building this brand for yourself and promoting yourself to potential clients is, first of all, understanding yourself. And I think that's a really good exercise for, I mean, I kind of want to do that exercise now, and probably a lot of people listening do as well, is to ask the people who I've worked with in the past or who know me really well, like, if you were to hire me, what would you hire me for? And it could just be like real quick, you know, like 2 words or whatever, like first thing that pops into mind. When you did this exercise, I'm curious, did you find that the things that people you asked said they would hire you for, were those the things that you actually wanted to do, or the things that you thought you were the best at as well? Did it align with what you were thinking?
I mean, I strategically chose people who I thought like knew me the best. So it did map pretty well. There was like a trait in there that I remember being like kind of surprised by, which was like this like sort of like a nurturing, like a motherly trait, which like I was like, oh, that's interesting. I don't really personally like associate as being that, but like multiple people were like, oh no, you like you really like stick up for your team and you like stick up for who you're working for. And I was like, huh. So that was like an interesting element. And I came across in some of the like character personas that people were using to like describe me, like Elastigirl from the Incredibles movie came up like twice. And I was like, that's so interesting, because she's like the mom in the family, but she's also like a superhero. The other exercise that I have done actually in every job change I did since like 2012 or 2016 is I map out my network. I'm like an insane networking person. So I like to map out my network in between every job change. So I first did this when I knew that I wanted to leave Stack Overflow, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I wrote a blog post about this like a long time ago called like the 4-box job posting or job searching grid, which I can send to you. But it was basically like a very simple exercise of understanding for yourself what do I like to do? What don't I like to do? What are my like must-haves, or what do I want to learn next? And then what are the absolute deal breakers? And I just like evaluated a lot of potential jobs, and then I put them all through this like 4-box criteria. And I remember there was this like really sad point where like the only job that fit all those criteria was this job at Union Square Ventures, but it wasn't actually even a job. It was just, I wanted the job of the person who was currently working there. And I was like, this is like really like a tough situation, because like no other job ended up meeting all those criteria, but it ended up like weirdly working out. So I think sometimes going through the exercise of like articulating that for yourself is really useful. And the way that I was able to cross off a lot of those other options is I mapped out the people in my network who I thought held jobs that seemed interesting to me. And I went and sort of talked to them about it. What do you like about this job? What does it do? What's the good things? What's the bad things? And I was just sort of like listening and scanning for what felt cool. The next time I did that exercise was when I was leaving to go fractional, and in a really meaningful way. I listed out the people in my life who I really admired, and I thought kind of maybe like lived outside, like one like click outside of my current network, where I was like, what do they do? And how do I get a little bit closer to what they're doing? And I used that exercise to sort of see like, what are the habits and the behaviors that they have taken on, and how could I do that too? But I also asked them, since they knew me, like, what would you hire me for? Would you pay me for this? And I started to get like really interesting feedback that people would hire me and pay me to do certain things. And that's how I was able to have the confidence to go and then pursue fractional work. So that was like a really helpful version of that exercise. And now my exercise is like, who in my network gives me energy, and what type of energy do they provide to me? And how do I use the anchoring energy of this network to like create the next sort of theme of my work? So that's like how I've been making decisions about job changes for many years. But that's also because I like approach work from a very like people first mindset.
Yeah, I love that like user research approach that you take to learning more about yourself, because I do think that a lot of people struggle to identify their core skill sets and what you call, I saw in one of your articles, what you call the spike areas.
Yeah.
And I think like that's a huge challenge for people to even understand about themselves, especially people like you and I who've had many career switches and done a variety of different things. It's like, well, this is what I'm trained in, but then this is what I've done. And then this is what I enjoy doing. And then this is what I want to learn how to do better. And there's all these different buckets, and it's hard to kind of like organize all of those and identify like where is that core skill set, like where is that spike area. And I like the user research approach of just crowdsourcing that and asking other people.
I mean, I think it's really, really helpful, because also every time you talk to someone about what you want to do or don't want to do, you get better at telling the story to yourself. It's like there's like a double use case there. But the other thing that is I think really important for anyone who's working fractionally is, this is actually still hard for me, is like decoupling the places that pay me money from the places I like to do the most work. Because like in my head, those things should equate the same. Like the thing I love should pay me the most money, but that's actually like not true. And sometimes the thing I want to do the least is the thing that's going to pay me the most amount of money, but then I can actually buy myself time to have more time to do the thing that I love, which isn't going to pay me money. So I think like looking at like the real balance, if you want to be sitting around every Saturday and Sunday baking in your Airbnb upstate, and you want to have like space to be free on the weekends, like what does that mean you need to do in your work week in order to buy you that space? Or like if you actually really just want to be writing screenplays, like what can you do that would give you the most amount of money so that you could buy more time to be doing that thing? So I think like sort of letting yourself trust that those options are on the table, even though they're looking invisible, is like a really important first step.
Yeah, it's definitely important to look at your situation holistically and see how everything fits into the puzzle and how everything balances. And I think this is actually a much more practical approach than some others I've heard, even with, like Ikigai, that Japanese concept of finding really like what you're passionate about. I think your approach is maybe less about matching what your passions are with where you can make the most money, and rather just saying, hey, maybe where I can make the most money is not at all what I'm passionate about, but it's going to open up more free time or more free resources for me to do those things that I am passionate about. So I just think it's a different approach that people can be thinking about as well when they're thinking about how to balance their lives.
Yeah, I think it's incremental in step. I'll also, by the way, say that I think crypto in particular is really like incredible for fractional work because everyone's working in a nomadic capacity. Everyone's working project to project. There's like this concept of bounties. There's this concept of like the gig economy that's just so prominent that I think crypto is such a great place to start this in. And for anyone who's working off hour cycle, like if you're working in Europe for a team that's based in the US, you're like working off hours, that buys you like interesting new ways to spend your day.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a friend who was working at a US based company, but wanted to go live in Europe for a little bit. And so she went in the winter and she would just wake up, go skiing every morning, and then start her workday in the afternoon when US people were waking up. Yeah. And so that's like how she lived for like an entire season that she was, living in Europe and working in the US, and it worked great for her.
And I think thinking about your work in like seasons is also so natural to crypto that it makes total sense to think about it for your personal work style too.
100%. Yeah. Like if you've been at a company for over a year in crypto, you're like one of the rare ones, right? That's like
for
eons. Sure. When you look for your fractional work too, do you typically go and see which companies are in need of which roles, like essentially scanning job boards and then identifying things that you could help with? Or do you essentially create your role? Do you maybe tap into your network and go get coffee with somebody who's working at this company and they're like telling you about their work and the needs that they have, and then something clicks in your brain and you're like, wait, this is what you need. I can help you with this. Let me pitch them and see if they want me to help them with this.
Yeah, it's more the latter for sure. I noticed that my best like amount of time in a fractional capacity is like 9 months. So typically the first 3 months I will come in, I will help a team understand. I typically get brought in to help push a first version of a project across the finish line. So that typically involves like a couple months of initial evaluation, discovery work. I'll do a lot of like user research, present a potential strategic plan of some sort. And then we decide, okay, do we want to implement this plan? And then there's like 6 months of implementation and execution work that follows that. So basically, after I'm out of that first phase of strategic discovery work is when I start looking for my next job. So I know I've got like 6 more months on a contract that's typically taking about 50% of my time. Well, I'll just start like meeting with people. And because I'm starting that process so long ahead, I will know. So to give an example, I met Devin Walsh at the Uniswap Foundation in December of 2022 and wasn't brought in on that team until the summer of 2023. So it was about 6 months lead time, actually, where we met. We hit it off. A couple months later, we got a coffee or a lunch. And I was like, oh, this is like a really cool team, a really cool project. But there wasn't really like an immediate need for my uses and skill sets at that point. But then over the summer, when everything with like Uniswap V4 started to click into focus, they were like, oh, we might need some additional operations help here. Let's see if Bethany's free. And it happened to be a perfect time because I had just gotten back from a big trip and had no projects. So I was like, great, let's jump in. So, it was like a long time coming, but then it all just clicked into place.
Yeah, that's a great case study to use because I wanted to ask you about your experience with Uniswap anyway. And I know you worked on their grants program, right? So can you just like give us the start to end using Uniswap as a case study, start to end of how all of this came about? So December 2022, sorry, you meet with Devin from Uniswap.
I just met her at like a happy hour. It was just like, we honestly met. I was like, oh, wow, it's so great to see like a woman running a crypto foundation. This is so great. Like we should be friends, basically is how it started. Then I kept her Telegram handle. We met up for like a lunch, maybe January, February of that year, had a great conversation, kicked around a bunch of ideas, but that was sort of it. They were looking to hire someone that spring. I think I made a couple referrals for them, but I wasn't ready for like a full-time thing. And then in the summer, they're like, oh, I guess V4 is really making us escalate our need to get this grants operations in a different place. Let's see if she's free. So I got a call. We talked about a potential like kind of accelerated strategy. It was like 6 or 8 weeks to get like a strategic plan out the door of what they could do. So came in, interviewed a bunch of companies, interviewed everyone on the team, talked to a bunch of stakeholders, talked to a bunch of developers, had a really fun time making this like market map about what would be possible in like crypto grants operations. I think it was like an 80 slide deck that I shared with them, and they were like, this is too much. But it was really it was really great. And then we like built it. So for the next 6 months, we basically executed against that, hired a bunch of people, and then I stuck around for another couple months to help with a couple of key strategic hires for the leadership team. I've never actually been like a hiring manager or a recruiter necessarily in that way, but I've seen a lot of people hire great people, and I kind of know what to look for. So I got to help them on a couple searches, which was fun.
Nice. And so was that timeline predetermined when you first started the project? No. So how does that work with some of the fractional work? Is it kind of just like when things are done and both parties kind of recognize that the project is completed, you both just say, okay, it looks like we're done here and move on?
Yeah, I mean, it really, this is like such a personal thing for folks, right? I think like a really nice thing about fractional work is you can like, as a company leader, you can quote unquote try before you buy. You can work with someone on a project before you commit to something long term. And that's almost more important to me as a fractional employee, because I have 2 kids now. I have a husband that has a crazy job. We travel a lot. I need to be able to ensure that the cadence of work is like matching my own lifestyle. So, I basically scoped it at first as just this strategic project. And then we got to the point of me like presenting it out. We realized what was needed in the sort of implementation phase. And I was like, okay, let me help do this. And like item number 1 was hire someone to run this after you. So it's often like in my job to hire someone to sort of keep it going from there. And then I think we scoped it for another 6 months, brought that person on. And then from there was a lot of other sort of needs internally that I was like, oh, I think I can help with that for a couple more months. I probably could have stayed on a little bit longer on like some other ops stuff too, but I was getting a little bit anxious to sort of track change out of crypto, like day to day into more of like AI capacity, because I've just been watching, I've been like watching AI and education just over the last year. I've been like very involved in education initiatives, workforce development for over 10 years in New York City. So I said to them, like, I don't actually have a next job, but I need to sort of wind down so I can like make more space, which is a scary thing to do.
Well, I would actually love to pivot into that, because I think, education and learning goes very much hand in hand with fractional work, especially for somebody like you, the way you approach it. You said earlier, you really like taking on new projects that you actually don't know much about. And I imagine it's like that challenge that is attractive to you, and like the opportunity to learn a lot when you're taking out something that you don't really know much about. So when it comes to learning and education, and again, we're talking about this like not just in the sense of like K-12 education, traditional education, but even for adults, like for people like us, people who want career changes, people who want to do fractional work, anyone in any stage of life who's constantly learning. What have been, I guess, like give us a little background on what you've been working on in this education AI space, and what, like where do you see AI fitting into all of this?
I'll maybe start by like framing a little bit more of the why around it, because I think it's kind of interesting. I alluded to this, but I graduated college in the middle of the 2008-2009 recession with a degree in journalism. That summer, I applied to 200 jobs as a fresh out of college graduate with 3 internships and couldn't get a single job. I learned later that 55% of people who graduated with a journalism degree that year had a job at the end of that year. So it was a really bad time for recent graduates. And I ended up getting a first job in a tech company. It was like a tech consultancy. And that really demonstrated for me immediately that this was a versatile degree that I could apply in a lot of contexts. That same time, my dad, who had worked his entire career in the automotive industry, got laid off as part of this great recession. And 30 years at one company, Ford, made it really hard for him to know how to pivot, because he had never had to do that ever before. And that is a very unfortunate reality for a lot of Americans that are trying to pivot or transition who don't have that sort of learned skill. And I think as a result of sort of seeing those things playing out simultaneously, I have really made it my personal mission to both be as versatile as possible, but also help others sort of see their own versatility in unique ways. And the more emerging technology changes the way that we work and the way that we learn, the more I am seeing that this toolkit that this generation of learners is growing up with is going to look really, really different. Then that means the jobs they're going to get are going to look really, really different. So how are we as educators thinking about what that means we need to be doing in a classroom context, and also how people are learning outside the classroom? And then for everyone like you and me, who is mid-career in the middle of these transformative changes that are literally giving me back 30% of my time because of how much I'm using AI, what does that mean for how we think about work, and how do we help other people who are stuck in the middle not fall off, but instead like you lean into these skills? So there's a whole like upskilling component of learning. And one of the things that I am proudest about, I guess, in moving into crypto with such gusto was that I learned a lot about how I learn as a grown-up, not in a classroom. That was not obvious to me in a way that it probably isn't obvious to a lot of people. But now that I've like sort of like completed a stack of going from, I don't really know this, to like landscaping and out, to like picking a couple of projects, to getting like a GM role at an open source engineering team. And now I'm on the board of a crypto company. I'm like, okay, I have like completed like an expert level stack here. And I can now apply that to learn other things too. So I've been thinking a lot about like, what does that mean for how we can learn, and what sorts of transferable learnings have I taken from this that I could pass along to other folks too? Because I think we're all going to be a little more generalist to apply these skills.
I completely agree. Can you talk a little bit more about your learnings for yourself personally, about how you learn and what that learning stack is, and how people can learn more about how they learn and identify their own personal learning stack?
Yeah, I mean, this is all like hot take summer here, so take this as you will. But I guess I will say that I think learning needs to start with a curiosity and a motivation to learn. And sometimes that is coming from like a really authentic and genuine place. Like, wow, like I wonder why the sky is blue. Let's like understand that. Or like, wow, I wonder why the subway is delayed. Let's like figure this out. And sometimes it comes from, I will say, like a deeper cut place of like frustration or like anger. And like people often like shy away from those negative reasons to learn something. But I have personally noticed that I am quite motivated by emotions that are not great, in the sense of like, I was mad that I graduated with a degree that felt irrelevant. And now I am very motivated to learn how to make that not the case for other people. I was frustrated that I didn't understand working about crypto, and I was motivated to learn to prove that I could, right? So like, I think you have to sort of understand like why you like to learn things. So like one question to ask yourself is, what is something new that I have learned recently, and why did I learn it? And if the answer is because I liked this person who was also doing it, that's fine. Like, just like lean into that and like find a way to find someone else you like so that they motivate you to learn something new. So that's like one. Second is, I think the hard part is going from like, I think I want to learn this, to what do I focus on? It's really helped me to find like a Sherpa, a person who's sort of like taking me up the mountain and pointing out the local sites that are safe. This is really important when moving into an industry like crypto, because you sort of need to know what projects are going to steal all of my money because they're scams, and what projects are run by good people that I can trust. And I found a couple of really good people who were able to make a lot of good intros for me really early on. And that helped me like basically tune my own radar for evaluating a good versus bad project. I'm trying to now tune my radar for that in AI, and I'm finding it like much harder actually, because you can't like gut check a project as well. Like there's a website I was looking at today about how that evaluated how much an AI model hallucinates compared to other models. And I'm like, whoa, like I really need to understand this, because if I'm trying to use AI to help me analyze some data of things that I'm working on, I need to have an understanding about like why I'm choosing which model and why one is good for one at the other. But in crypto, it's a lot more like apparent, because it's all sort of black and white. So once I sort of get through that Sherpa phase of learning where to learn, then you sort of need to get into like the independent discovery work, which takes like another turn, right? I'm reading white papers, I'm digging into Discord chats, I'm attending conferences, I'm talking to people, I don't really know what they're saying. And that's often a point of frustration where you might think to yourself, like, I can't do it. And I think then you sort of have another sort of learning hump of like, how do I learn this? What else can I do? What's going to motivate me? And then if you don't find like a reason to stay learning, I think that's where people will drop off. And for me, luckily, the reason to stay learning in the crypto space, even when it was really hard to get onboarded, was I started to meet such smart, amazing, talented people in crypto. And I started to go to the events and I started to stay in like hacker houses. And I was having as much fun as I had had early on in like the 2010s Web 2 era. And I was like, this is amazing. So that really motivated me to stay. And then you start seeing like incremental improvements. And then you sort of like repeat the cycle. Like, okay, now I have like the 101 level. Who's like a 201 expert? Let's learn the next set of skills. And then there's a moment where you have like your first opinion that like sounds kind of smart. And you're like, that's like a breakthrough. I have something smart to say about a topic that someone else thought was smart. Cool. And then you could just sort of like kind of go in from there.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think for me too, like I've always said, because when I sort of did like, I went from like 0 to 100 when I joined crypto. There was no like dabbling around. It was like, as soon as I learned about it, like I was working full time in crypto and creating
What motivated
content.
you? Do you remember?
So my backstory is I was at a content agency before, and we were helping B2B businesses start podcasts. And I had started my own podcast that was just about startups, like Web 2 startups. And somehow the CEO and co-founder of Unstoppable Domains, a blockchain domain company, found my podcast and hired our agency to help Unstoppable start a podcast. And then basically Aqua hired me or poached me or whatever you want to call it, like a month into that relationship. And so yeah, so I started working in crypto full time and had no idea about anything. I mean, it was literally like a month into learning about, like obviously I had like bought some Bitcoin back in 2017 or whatever, but I was a month into actually learning and understanding what decentralization meant. And I was having to host a podcast there and interview really smart people in DeFi and, people who've been doing crypto stuff since like 2011. And here I am a month into learning about all of this. It was like super stressful, but also like very fun and exciting too, because I was learning so much so fast. And so I've always encouraged people to create content as a way to learn, because when you have to write an article about something or talk about something on a podcast or make a video about something and explain a concept back, then you're really testing your own knowledge about it and how well you truly understand it. Because it's easy to listen to somebody talk and be like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. But then it's like, well, okay, tell it back to me. That's like, like in school, like growing up, teachers would be 100%. Like, well, say it back to me. Like 100%. Teach it back to me. And that's when you're like,
It's so interesting that you say that, because that is also very true for how I have learned. And one of my earliest jobs working at all in crypto was helping this like very early stage accelerator of like crypto founders learn about building businesses. And they had me present on community building best practices from like Web 2 and what we could learn in Web 3. And I presented once at the beginning of the cohort and once like at the end. And in the meantime, I had done, under their guidance and supervision, this like decentralized community research project that took me like 100 hours. I interviewed like 12 companies. I published this like 20,000 word essay like the day before I got induced with my second baby. It was so absurd. But then I was like, wow, I have like all these great people that I've learned from and all these opinions about what this means. And I was able to like lean on those frameworks. And then when I was working at the Uniswap Foundation, the same thing was true. I had never run a grants program before. I had never worked in a foundation before. And they asked me to teach them how to do that type of thing. So I was running weekly structured workshops for the whole team about like how to run a grant strategy, which was something I had also never done. And I realized you really only needed to be like 1 or 2 weeks ahead in order to like teach back the course. And there was something like very like energizing about that concept. But you're right in that like if you learn a little, then you teach it back. It's like such a good way to cement the learning.
Yeah, 100%. So with AI then, how are you incorporating AI into your learning stack? Is it just asking ChatGPT a lot of things to learn faster, or is there something else with AI that, people can use?
I use AI for basically every part of my workflow right now. I've gotten better. One of the things I've gotten really good at is using AI in my workflow. And it's because I change jobs so much. So every time I change jobs, I have a new workflow and I'm sort of inventing new ways of using AI to do it. I worked with this team, this open source engineering team recently, where I was like a GM and it was me and 15 engineers. And they needed help basically doing everything that wasn't distributed systems engineering, which was like LOL hilarious. So I built myself a ChatGPT leadership team. So I built like a CEO coach, I built a head of people, I built a legal GPT, I built a finance GPT, I built a VP of engineering, and I built like a research assistant. Okay. And I trained them all on different aspects of this work. And I am still not a distributed systems peer-to-peer expert and engineer, but I got really good at learning how to take content that was given to me, like explain it in a way that made sense to me, like form an opinion about that version of the content, translate it back, and then relate it back to the team. And I also was able to use AI to help me understand from a more generalist concepts, like what the topic themes were. And then I could find experts and like drill into that area. So that was like a really fun way of like vastly accelerating learning. And now, I mean, it was like a very stressful way of also learning. That might not be how everyone likes to learn. But now I'm able to use AI in like really deep specialist ways to help me do the stuff that I normally do really well, even faster, which is part of why I have a lot more time for things like writing again.
How challenging was it to like learn how to use GPT in more advanced ways, like you were saying, like building yourself a CEO and a legal team and all of these? Like, how challenging was that process? Because I've never done that. I wouldn't know how to do it if you asked me today.
And I think it's like, honestly, I feel like it's a stealth superpower for like 6 months because it's so easy. It's honestly so easy. It's like you just literally create a custom GPT, like upload whatever content, explain what you want it to do. And there's so many tutorials about this. And then you've got basically a mediocre manager for every functional area in your life. And I say mediocre because like an average, the outputs are like a B level output. But honestly, in the world of startups where you don't have anyone, like having someone who's like a B player is like sometimes way better than having like someone like in person to like kind of contend with. So I would encourage you to really try it out.
Yeah, no, I absolutely will. I really like have not taken advantage of GPT and AI as much as I should, as it is becoming very clear to me as I'm having this conversation with you. So I absolutely will. I might be hitting you up for tips if I get stuck or anything, but it sounds like it's a pretty easy process now.
I think it is, but it also, it's a habit. It's not a step, right? And I think I have officially made it a habit because I like increasingly put myself into situations where I'm using it. So I'm actually going to do like a course for people who want to go fractional. Here are tips on going fractional, and here are tips on how to fractionalize your life using AI. So stay tuned for that. And I think there's a lot of like very, very easy low-hanging fruit like hacks that you can do to like make your workflows a lot easier.
Okay, I need that. 100%. I need that.
Amazing. Great.
Okay, I know we have about 5 minutes left. There was one other thing I wanted to ask you about. So one of your fractional projects right now is Hero, which is a developer tooling platform for builders on Bitcoin.
Yeah.
This stood out to me because I think most of our listeners exist primarily within the Ethereum ecosystem, and it's kind of been this longstanding joke about like builders on Bitcoin, like what like you can build on Bitcoin. So can you just give us the high level, tell us more about building on Bitcoin? What does that entail? What are people building? Are there actually cool apps there? Like, can you actually do stuff on Bitcoin? These may seem like very dumb questions, but I think a lot of people are wondering the same.
I think it's a really good set of questions. And I do think it is one of the fastest growing areas that I'm foreseeing and hopeful of. Obviously, I'm biased because I'm on the board of this company, Hero. I like to look at where potential energy and kinetic energy lives in markets, right? So there's a lot of kinetic energy in like Ethereum and Solana right now. There's like building happening. There's apps being developed. We're sort of like transitioning out into things like the consumerization and applications through tools like Farcaster that are like really like launching that into warp speed. But then there's this like potential energy of like the market cap of Bitcoin just like sitting here, right? And there's so much underlying value of this asset, and that is not going away, and it is not leaving, and it is just continuing to grow and mature and develop and attract the attention of like traditional finance and continue to attract the attention of like investors. Slowly and surely, you've been seeing like little things chipping away through work like ordinals, through work like all these Bitcoin L2s. So like Stacks is the ecosystem that I'm closest to. There's like a programming language called Clarity that helps bring smart contracts to Bitcoin. That's like starting to enable some of these applications like DeFi, like NFTs. And I think that there's like a couple of things that I'm learning that, there's like interesting opportunity here that is like untapped. The next bull market run that's going to bring in a lot more developers in to crypto, generally speaking. I think there's like a lot of entrepreneurial opportunities for folks to be building just due to the lack of established infrastructure that's already there. I also think it's a much more like free space, but that means there's a lot more discovery work that sort of needs to happen there. There's like a lot more tools than ever before, but I do think things are starting to get like really, really interesting there. So yeah, it's been a really fun project.
What are most of the apps you're seeing built there? Is it primarily DeFi related?
I think there's a lot that needs to be still built on DeFi. It's still like a very, very open ecosystem. And I think, I worked along Ethereum builders for the last 3 to 4 years. I've been really impressed by how the Ethereum community really catalyzes networks and creativity and developer adoption and like fun. I think Bitcoin, the ecosystem, could learn a lot from that. But since I started working with the Bitcoin ecosystem and Hero, I really think that Bitcoin has this reputation of being like trusted, secure, professional, like highly financialized. And like, honestly, the Ethereum ecosystem could learn a little bit from that. So I think it's cool to sort of see the opportunity spaces sort of play out. I also just through working with what we're seeing happen in DeFi and like the Ethereum world, like what I saw happening at Uniswap, I've learned a lot about what motivates developers to start financial applications and tools. And I keep thinking about the tens of thousands of developers that are trapped in these centralized banking institutions, building things for people that have already like been running these businesses the same way for decades. And I'm asking like, what's it going to take to get some of them excited to come over and start building something on Bitcoin instead, because there's like a real interesting opportunity right now.
Interesting. I'll have to dive more into that and learn more about that. Super interesting. But it's good to hear that, people are building things on it. I think that's always a good signal. So last thing, Bethany, we ask every guest on the podcast this for a can you not, and this can be just a pet peeve of yours in this space, just something that you want to be like, can you not do this? Do you have one prepared for us today?
For you specifically, or for just like the world?
Oh, just in general. Unless there's one specifically about me that you would like to say, feel free.
Can you not send me political texts from people who are current politicians? Because I'm getting too much and I can't handle it. And I unsubscribe to everything and it drives me crazy.
Same thing with Twitter. Like half my Twitter feed is just political campaign stuff, political ads now. And I'm like, I'm just here for crypto Twitter. Like, can we not?
Can you not?
Yeah, can you not? That's a good one. I like it. And last thing, tell people where they can find you if they want to follow you personally, and feel free to plug away at your newsletter, anything else you'd like.
BethanyCrystal.com is my website. I've got a Paragraph newsletter and I'm on, Twitter and Warpcast. So you can find me there.
Perfect. We'll link all those in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for taking the time today, Bethany. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Yeah, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Rehash. Rehash is hosted and produced by me, Diana Chen. Rehash is also supported by our community of NFT holders who curate our guest lineup each season. To get involved, head over to our website at rehashweb3.xyz and collect this episode as an NFT. Anyone who collects an episode becomes part of the Rehash community and will be able to nominate guests for future seasons. To learn more about how to become a guest on the podcast, go to rehashweb3.xyz/podcast. And to learn more about sponsoring the podcast, go to rehashweb3.xyz/sponsor. Finally, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at rehashweb3, or on Warpcast and Lens at Rehash. And join our community on Telegram at t.me/rehashweb3. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next week.